Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams Burch, and this podcast, it exists for you. Whether you're a music lover, an educator, a choir member, each week we bring guests to the show to help explore what matters in music. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the show. Welcome to this very special PD Week rebranded episode. What, Dr. Burch, is this PD Week you talk about? Way back in summer of 2020, we did a week-long patron episode release week of professional development. And during this week, we released 3 episodes a day about vocal technique and rehearsal strategies and all sorts of stuff to really fill our cups as we got ready for the year ahead, the year of unknown. And you know what? We made the best friendships at this time. We were listening to the episodes. We had morning coffees and evening happy hours. And from that, we have our weekly patron meetups. And it was so much fun. Anyway, if you're not on Patreon, you didn't get to hear all those episodes. And this is one of those episodes that you really need to hear. So I'm bringing it back. But I'm bringing it back on purpose right now because we have just decided when we're doing Teacher PD Week, PD standing for Professional Development, for 2021. We're looking at the third week of July. That's the 23rd, 24th, 25th of July, 2021. If you want to find out more, feel free to reach out to me, emilyburch.org/contact, or better yet, join in the conversation and help us decide exactly what you want for your PD weekend. 2021 July, Savannah, woot woot, can't wait to hang out. Anyway, enough of me. I cannot wait to let you hear episode 48. This is Dr. Steve Sieck and Inclusive Pedagogy, brought to you by our friends at the Kinnison Choral Company. I attended a training a couple years ago that was offered to any instructors or professors that taught classes at a certain university. It was called Safe Zone Ally Training. And over the course of 3 different classes that we attended, we learned definitions and stereotypes and tips and techniques for creating the best safe space for all learners, especially those in the LGBTQIA++ category. It was a fascinating experience, but by no means should it be something that I go through once every 2 years. It's something that we have to stay in the know with. What is the correct terminology? How do you coach someone who is transitioning or exploring? Is that even the right word? And what really happened as we were curating the episodes for PD Week, and we were originally calling Monday Vocal Technique Day, and we called Vic Oak's episode Guy Technique, and Dr. Lynn Gackle's episode Girl Technique. We started to think, well, does that really encompass every singer in our choir, and what should we be calling it? This sent us on a mission to find answers. We wanted to try to use choral experts to answer these questions from a choral perspective. Enter Dr. Steven Sieck. He wrote a book called Inclusive Pedagogy, and in this episode, he'll talk about that book, why he wrote it, what he'd change about it, and what you can learn by reading it. He has such fantastic input and thought, and you'll hear that it is our responsibility to do the research, the reading, just like we've been saying all week long. This gives you a starting point for that. Some definitions, some thoughts, and some fabulous analogies to break down those binary barriers. Your students deserve that space to be the most authentic version of themselves. And this is one way we can create that space. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Today on the show, we are welcoming Dr. Steven Sieck from Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. Welcome.
Well, it's great to be here.
Yeah. I'm so glad. Thank you for being here. How long have you been up there in the Appleton area?
10 years. Just finished my 10th year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's how long I've lived in Savannah. That goes by so fast, doesn't it?
It does. I had a lot more hair 10 years ago. Yeah.
Well, we're talking today because my friend Philip Swan connected us via text message, and it has been so much fun digging into this book that you wrote and just looking at some of the things that you've done. So for the listeners who don't know you, can you give us your elevator pitch? Who are you? How did you get to where you are? What makes you you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm a choir director. I grew up in the Chicago area. My undergrad is actually not a choral degree. I got a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Chicago, but I focused on music there. Moved out to LA, taught 7th through 12th grade, sang professionally in that area. We were ready for grad school at that point, my wife and I. So went to grad school in Illinois. Taught for 5 years in the Appalachian corner of Virginia, doing sort of a choir/voice position. And then I've been in Appleton for 10 years. So I mentioned my undergrad because I come to this a little bit as an outsider, as someone who had a better undergrad education in like philosophy and Western history than in how to get a good cutoff on beat 4 and things like that. So, and I'm very, very grateful for that odd path that took me to where I am right now.
So what type of ensembles do you have at Lawrence University?
Yes, it's an interesting school because there's about 1,400 students on campus, right? So a lot of high schools are actually bigger than that. But the School of Music is very big. We have about 340 undergrads getting some form of a music degree, and about 100 of them are in a voice primary degree. It's an opera-focused voice program, so we work with some big old voices, which is fun and exciting and very different than sort of like your classic undergrad choral program. And Philip and I co-direct the program. We have 4, curricular ensembles. I work with the 90-voice Yalcum choir called the Viking Chorale. And then I also tend to be the primary director for our, advanced SATB concert choir. Philip is the legendary director of the legendary Lawrence Cantala Women's Choir, which is the best choir in America, from my opinion. And then I started a bass clef ensemble for really doing very good work, but sort of we're not sure where to put them yet, tenors and basses. So it's been a lot of fun.
That is a lot of fun.
I also teach in the choral methods sequence. So.
Oh, well, we'll have to talk about that. I've been working on all my choral methods syllabi for the upcoming year. Would love to hear. That's another conversation. But you have to tell people about how your school year is structured, because it's different than most university structures.
Yeah, we have a 10-week trimester. I think Chicago does that. Carleton does that. It's sort of a British model. And so what that ends up meaning is that you either do 2 very quick concert cycles, right, 4 weeks and 5 weeks or something like that, or a longer 8 or 9 week process. So the students end up doing 5 concerts in a year.
That's amazing.
Which is exciting. Yeah, we go September to November, January to March, March to June.
That's incredible. I know that Philip talked a lot about that structure and how it changes the approach. So let's totally switch gears, because now that we know who's in front of you, tell me about, you wrote a book. It's published with Hal Leonard. The link is actually in the episode notes. Tell us about your Teaching with Respect.
Sure. Well, this was not a book that I could have imagined writing 10 years ago. As I said, I came here as someone who had sort of this dual interest in liberal arts research and reading and critical thinking, and the art of singing in choral ensembles well. And so I thought that was going to be enough for a good career. And, first couple of years, we were going off gangbusters. And sometime around, I would say, fall of 2014 or 2015, we had some students pushing back on our repertoire choices and saying, can you tell us why this is the concert closer? Or you thought about, so that was in relation to a spiritual that we were performing, or I was doing a scene from Traviata because we were doing a cycle about travelers. And so I was doing a gypsy scene from Traviata, and they said, well, gypsy's kind of an offensive term. And have you thought about how this represents Roma people? And I just sort of scratched my hair. I had hair at the time. I was sort of scratching it going, I have no idea what you're talking about. This is music. Music's just music. It's a concert, and I was really pretty dismissive at the time to students who were bringing up these concerns and going like, look, congratulations, you're 19, you're taking a musicology class, but like life's more complicated than this. And I had this amazing student kind of call me in. She didn't really call me out. She called me into conversation and said, that doesn't strike me as the kind of teacher that you represent yourself to be in other situations. Do you think we could talk a little bit more? So we did. And this student lives every day in a very different world than I do. She's Black, she's female, she's queer, right? And it just walking through what that was like for her versus me. And then I just had this choice. I was either going to realize that I was in the matrix, right, and take I think it's the red pill.
The red pill, yeah,
and
red, blue.
yeah, and follow down to realize all the things I wasn't seeing, or go, get out of my choir. So I just started reading. We'd never had an ethnic studies class in my undergrad. I didn't take any gender studies. So the short version is that this is a book for people like me that don't have to have these conversations if we want to just kind of close our ears and our eyes. But what I ended up learning from that process was valuable enough that I'd wished someone who wasn't 20 could have sat down with me, because the tragedy of this is that a 20-year-old had to sit down with me and explain to me the impact of my decisions. So it's a book that walks through identity and what it is you're actually trying to do in your choir. That's the short version.
Ooh, identity and what you're doing in choir. So how long from the 20-year-old calling you in to the book, how much time did you do the research before the book happened after that conversation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I started reading pretty much right away. So that would have been in the fall. And then by the early spring, I realized that there was so much to unpack that this might be something that other people could use some help unpacking. So then I worked with a student research grant, with a student who's doing an anthropology degree and a music degree. So she was geeking out about it, like, oh, have you heard about, this theory of race and this theory? And we were just back and forth throughout the spring into the early summer. And then I had a draft of the book on my computer by the fall, but I didn't think, I'd send it to a publisher that we won't name out loud, that just sort of sat on it. And I did a presentation at the state conference about this in it, and everyone said, please turn this into a book. Actually, I did. So I sent it to Hal Leonard, and he got back to me like the next day and said, yes, we're on. So that was within a year, really.
Wow, that's a fast turnaround. So where were you finding...
It felt fast, yeah.
So you worked with an anthropology major. Were you finding the research to read outside of obviously outside of the music field? Where were you looking? What journals, what articles, what books, what were you finding?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly not, and there are people that actually do this, like that get PhDs in these actual fields. So it was just cribbing everyone else's research and mapping that onto the choral experience. But like a classic book that I think most people probably have read by now would be Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And of course, once you find that, then you also find his extraordinary article on the case for reparations. And as someone who grew up in Chicago, his whole argument about the redlining, I saw it, like I lived it. And then finding sort of initial gender studies readings like Virginia Woolf, and then getting from that into like more complicated gender studies like Wendy Seeley Harrison and Judith Butler. And Judith Butler, who actually intersects then also with feminism and music study. So, I mean, it was all there. And I guess that's the other thing is like 15 years ago, if you wanted to learn about this, you'd be in the card catalog and you'd be reading the books sideways in the library. And now you can just Google conversations on cultural appropriation. So there was more than enough there, I guess, is the short version.
Yeah, but you took it for us and you funneled it through the What Do You Need to Know as a Choir Director nozzle, and have put out this book and you call it Inclusive Pedagogy. Can you kind of unpack that choice in this? So it's called Teaching with Respect, and then subtitle Inclusive Pedagogy for Choral Directors. Can you tell us where that terminology came from?
Well, and that's actually one of the things I would change if we did a second version. So inclusive suggests that you and I are sitting in the center of this as white people, right? And then we're getting to include everyone else. And that's in itself sort of a hegemonic discourse of like, you are welcome to join our party. And so I think the language, in fact, has changed from that to culturally responsive or sort of culturally, I guess I would just say like aware that there are multiple ways to look at this. But at the time, inclusive pedagogy just meant getting outside of the whole, I am your professor, you're welcome. Here's what you need to know. If I don't teach it, you probably don't need to know it, right?
Right.
Bach was born in 1685. Bach died in 1750. You're welcome. So inclusive was meant to be, at that point in time, getting outside of a very narrow framework of what one needs to know.
Perfect. I think that's a good definition or explanation of that, especially as a lot of people are just coming to the research, coming to the table. And the conversation in this podcast started as we were curating all of the episodes for this Teacher PD week. One of the curators said, well, what are you doing about transgender voices or people that don't fit the normal male and female encounter? And that's where I called Philip, because I don't even know if I knew what the correct terminology would be. And so that's something that your book really talks well about. Can you give us some of the terminology and some of the things that you really learned in creating this research and writing this book that could help us that don't know what's the right thing to say?
Yeah, and I'm going to put a pin in this, but remind me to come back to it later about the fear of terms. And I desperately want to come back to that.
Okay.
So at the start of the book, well, okay, a little bit before that, because Lawrence does a fantastic job of being a thriving space for a lot of transgender students and faculty. So I got there a little ahead of the curve on that one. But coming to Lawrence, I assumed that there were two genders, male and female, and that was when you were born, the doctor said, this is what you are, and that's how you behaved, and that came with a certain set of behaviors, like I like football. And so first acknowledging that even the idea that you're born one of two genders is in itself scientifically inaccurate, that there are plenty of people that are born intersex, right, showing characteristics of both genders. So that blows open the binary into, I guess, a trinary. And then from that, there's how do you identify? How do you express, right? So we talk about maybe gender as a spectrum or as something wider than just sort of bin 1 or bin 2. And that was, and I had the great pleasure to work with a variety of transgender students at Lawrence, some of whom were also transitioning, right, hormonally. Or were not, right? So you could be a bass and be female, right? Or you could be a soprano and be male, but you could also be male and having your voice change at 20, right? So the way we can say this is assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. So my son is transgender, so he is AFAB, assigned female at birth, right? So when he was born, it was she. Right, and we raised her as a daughter, and then at some point she said, I don't identify female. Let's try non-binary terms." So then they were such and such, right? So that would be non-binary. Is when you don't say I'm female or you don't say I'm male. And then shortly thereafter said, yeah, we're on the right track. I'm male. So now my son is he. So we call him a transgender male or a female to male, FTM. FTM trans would be sort of the short version. And so we use he, him pronouns, right? And so then there's also then decisions that the transgender students have to decide about, like, do I want to go through hormone changes? Do I want to go through all those pieces as well? And that's that student's business and not the teacher's, except in as much as you can hear someone's voice cracking and you're like, your voice is changing. So in terms of language, then you can say cisgender, which would describe me, right? Cis means on the same side of, right? So I was born male and still identify male and express male and act male, whatever that means. And transgender meaning on the other side of, right, from the Latin. So born female identifies male. And then also non-binary, where someone says, yeah, I don't feel that, right? Or gender fluid, which would be, some days I feel more like a guy, some days I feel more like a female. So I think that it's not, it's really just about sort of blowing up the bins that we put them in.
That's a great analogy too, the blowing up of the bins, because you've given us, we have the cis explanation, the trans explanation, and within that, where they're falling with the pronouns and with expression versus, I don't think experimentation is the right word, but I think what I'm hearing you say is the awareness of your student is the most important thing. and knowing where they are. What about vocally? What do you do when, for example, your son's voice? How
Mhm.
does a choir director coach your son vocally?
Right. So my canonical approach was always, I know way more about the voice than you. I will tell you where you sing. And I did that with the student who I didn't realize was trans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, like 6 years ago. Um, and that student said, no, hell no, no choir for me, right?
Ah,
Because I had said, you're a tenor, you should sing in the tenor section. But she did not want to be a tenor, right? Um, so I find with students where now I just ask as they're coming in, please let us know your pronouns, right?
mm-hmm.
So if someone's coming in with a very low voice and saying, my name is Daisy, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm going, which section would you like to sing
Mm.
in? Right. And 95% of the time, students are saying whichever one my voice sounds the best in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of that also depends on, like, I don't know, are the sopranos and altos in dresses and the tenors and basses in tuxes? Like, that's a huge thing in terms of expression.
Yes.
So if you can wear whatever you want that represents you, like if you said, Steve, you're a tenor, we can tell because you speak a fifth higher than most guys we interview. So you need to wear a dress. I'd be like, maybe not.
Right.
Like, it wouldn't kill me. It's just not my jam. And so just in the same way that I'm not going to feel my best performing in a dress, neither would someone else who identifies as male.
Right.
Even if their voice is in the soprano section. So I think a lot of it is actually the cart before the horse, right? If we're going to binary the ensemble into y'all wear dresses, y'all wear tuxes, then the student immediately has to make a choice.
Mm-hmm. So that's something we changed right away in our ensemble here in Savannah. Was you, as long as you match the look, you choose.
Yeah.
And that's been really helpful as we had our first student come through and experience non-binary and changing pronouns. And it's been such a cool conversation starter. But
Mm-hmm.
they're not having the same education. Like, I've not met a 19-year-old who's willing and ready to have those conversations with me about these things, because it's not a conversation being had commonly, I feel, in this part of the South.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's so important for us as choir people, which is usually the safe haven for the singer, to be aware. So let's talk about that fear, because that's still really present in my heart right now. So the fear of terms, let's talk through that.
Yeah, so I think about it this way. What's that book? Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, right? Where he's trying to expose worker conditions in meat packing plants, and it ended up instead creating the Food and Drug Administration from the outcry, right? And I think the quote was like he was aiming for America's heart and got them in the stomach. And so I think that comes up a little bit with my book, where sort of the conclusion is that Stephen Foster is canceled.
And you're like, what? That's what I meant to say is, like, let's just take a minute with whatever you're performing to just read about it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're like, when I was in college and choir of 40 of the most brainiac, future PhDs in the world, and we all sang Stephen Foster, none of us in 1995 went to the library to, like, look up a book on, like, who's Stephen Foster? Who is he writing for? Because if we had, we would have gone, right? There's, it didn't even occur to us that there's such a thing as blackface minstrelsy, right?
Right.
Because we didn't talk about that in our American history class. So the broader argument in the book is honor your intellectual curiosity. And it's so much easier on the internet now to be like, who is Stephen Foster? And like, Stephen Foster wrote for the Virginia, Christie Minstrel Singers. And you're like, what are those? And you click through and then you are aghast, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not about what's canceled as much as it is be curious about what you sing, and about what it means. In the same way that, like, when you're in a voice lesson, of course they make you do the translation, but they're like, but what is the Countess feeling right now, right? And you have to, like, make a decision about, well, she's mad at the Count because he's after Susanna. And I think we owe it to ourselves and to our students to have that same curiosity. It's been my experience that when I worried about not saying the wrong thing, I wasn't teaching well, and there was a barrier between me and students, because I was just trying not to step on things the wrong way. And that when I was authentically trying to learn and trying to be intellectually curious and to hear another student's experience, that they would willingly and happily kind of show me what it is I needed to see, even if I was using sort of a term in the wrong way. I think the biggest issue I have with the terms is that we're hoping that by using the right terms, the problems will go away. And what I want to say here and everywhere is that the problems took 400 years to make. And the problems aren't going to go away when we use the right terms. The problems are going to go away when we do the work. So there's no term that you can say when you're trying to work on something that is in the vicinity of potential racism, right? Specifically white against black racism. That's going to undo the 400 years of remarkably constructed violent racism. So if you ended up saying that this was a Negro spiritual instead of an African American spiritual, yes, that is a term that we don't use anymore. But that's the more interesting question: is why are you programming it spiritual? What are you hoping from that process? How are you teaching that? Then is this the right term to use here? So that, I think, is the sort of the hidden tragedy of our term fear, is that transgender identity is a dangerous identity to have in America in terms of violence, right? The statistics, particularly if it's male to female, particularly if it's a person of color who's male to female, the crime statistics on that are horrifying. So creating a space where you see that student and you see her and you and you respect her and you have a space for her to sing her songs in this space is, I think, the first step. And then making sure that, so MTF trans, identifying, right? Those are terms that you can Google.
Right.
And I've had a lot of colleagues who are African American that every now and then will just put up on Facebook, just friends, as a reminder, I'm not your Google for Black issues. Like, there's literally Google.
Yes.
You can just Google, what is the term for this? And so the other piece to the term thing that I worry about is that we just find someone who is in that neighborhood and then say, educate me on all this, please. And that, in short, is why I wrote the book, is because we shouldn't have to turn to the most oppressed student we know and say, catch me up on all this, which is exactly what I did. And the only way to sort of make that right was to say, what if a white person explained to other white people why these are problems?
Yes, that explains this book so much more. And I'm so thankful that this platform exists, that we can have these conversations, because what you're saying, you're giving us little tidbits to understand, but you've also provided resources and other research that we can do on our own. And what I hear you saying is there is no wrong term. There's just not knowing why you're choosing a term. There is no wrong path. It's just not creating an open path for all singers. Well,
I mean, I guess I would revise it as that there are definitely more and less harmful terms, right? Okay. And I try to address that. Like, transvestite's not a word we use anymore. Hermaphrodite's not a word we use anymore. So there are for sure wrong words.
Okay.
But I think we will find those words when we are curious enough about our students to just Google, what is transgender?
Yes.
And then you'll get, you can even just go to the Gala choruses, right? Which has an amazing resource on that. You don't need, although there are amazing books, right? Josh Palkey's Handbook for Transgender Singers. I think that's Oxford. You can go into it deep if you want, but even just starting with, I see that this person has a different lived experience than mine, and I would like to know more about that. The terms will come as a byproduct of your curiosity about how other students live their lives.
I love how you said that. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I lost my thought there.
I'm sorry. I just love how
no, it's me. Yeah.
To be able to look in the reflection of the student looking back on you and having the awareness that they have a different lived life than me, and I want to know more about that. And instead of going to that student and, hey, tell me more about your life, you do the research and bring the questions to the table after you've done the research.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think about it this way, that the default in our brains is that we're the protagonist in the story. Right. So there's in the movie of Steve, there's the origin story. There's the, and Steve's at the old Spinet playing the TV jingles, and the parents are like, "Whoa, that's interesting. That's a talent." And then there's like the training montage of practicing the Mozart, and like the conducting teacher who breaks you down and builds you back up. And then it culminates in the scene today where I've come in with this exquisitely prepared rehearsal plan on Comme Jesu Comme, and and it's all IPA'd and breath marks are on the score and it's up there. And I see this one out there who's just like sulking in the corner and it's just, stone-faced and like not engaging, participating. And so from the protagonist's story, there's like then the teacher goes in and changes her life, right? But from her story, it could be something as simple as she got into a terrible argument with her roommate like 20 minutes before choir. Or it could be something as massive as trauma or abuse, right, that happened in the last week. And from my story, this student is not showing the kind of behavior that we expect in this space, right? And from her story, like I'm a supporting character at best, right? And she's showing up out of respect for this community that we're building together, but her head is not in it today for reasons that I might not understand. And those reasons could have nothing to do with me, right? And I took so personally for so long different attitudes in the space because I was the protagonist, right? And the choir was the supporting character in my life, right? And when you start to see our interdependence, right, that we are all sharing each other's air, which is blowing our minds in COVID, right?
Right.
That we are all literally interdependent in the air we breathe, then it really opens up to a different thing. Which brings me to the conversation, if I can just monologue for a second, about like, what are you trying to do in this room? And your podcast is awesome, so you get to meet with so many different directors, but I imagine that we say a couple things, right? We say, I'm trying to build a choral community where we pursue artistic excellence and we support each other, and there's this level of trust and relationship, and every student finds their voice, both literally and metaphorically, and right. And we say all these things, but like the work that we do 90% of the time is like uniformity of cutoffs, uniformity of vowel, uniformity of pitch and dynamic, and even literally the tone from your voice. I want you to sound like her. I want all of you to sound like one voice. Which it's a lot harder when you work with future opera singers, but like and I got to tell you, like I also wrote a book on choirs that go to ACDA, and you absolutely need that uniformity if you're going to go to that level, right? But uniformity and community can sometimes work at cross purposes.
Yes.
So if what you're trying to get is a uniformity of like a cultural experience, that's awfully hard to do with 90 college students, right? Because you're trying to get this kid that grew up on a farm and this kid that grew up in the city and this kid that grew up in the suburb to all agree with your perspective. Right? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying that it's a lot easier to get to ACDA by wielding the intonation sword than it is by creating a space where everyone is seen and heard and then collectively agrees to follow your perception of intonation.
You're giving us so many beautiful visuals. You speak in such clear examples that even though no one can see you, you've given us the binary bins that need to be exploded because it's not binary. And you've given us this vision of the monologue of you're the main character in the story, and just stop and think. And then you have this one here where it's not just your vision, but it's how do you get everyone to it and then make it the vision of everyone, not just yours. I feel like those are three really beautiful images that the listeners can take whatever one resonates most with you. But I feel like I have learned a lot today speaking to you, not just about terms or the lack thereof or how to do my research or your wonderful book, but also as a human and as a director, this is very invigorating.
Well, thank you. It's always fun to talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it. Yeah.
So you're doing this because how did you get bit by that choir bug? That's when I think I missed that connection. How did you go from that bachelor's of arts kind of non-traditional approach? How did you get bit by the choir bug?
Yeah, I think that's trying to figure out a good way to say it. I think my first choir experience was in ninth grade. And it was a retiring director who was legendary. He was absolutely amazing. And there were 100 kids in like each choir, right?
Wow.
And I thought, this is so cool. And then I had a series of directors afterwards that were kind of in transition in their career, or they were there for a year. And so we just sort of watching the program fall apart. And then freshman year in college, his director that had been there for a long time and sort of had like a cult around him, and it was so cool. And then there's a transition for a couple of years, and that director ended up being amazing. But during the transition, sort of things fell apart for a while. And so I was just always fascinated with like, how was this so good last year and so struggling this year? And why were we so like uniform in our vision last year and so like at each other's, how when a choir's not doing well, everyone hates everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so that always fascinated me, like what makes this experience not is amazing. So most kids will say like, oh, I had, my seventh grade teacher was amazing, and from that day on I always wanted to do choir. And I actually had like sort of a reverse situation of like,
Right.
What could this be, right? And I think that when back to my job in 2015, when everyone hated everything and everyone was yelling at everyone and me, I was like, well, I know I don't want this.
Right.
I've lived this and now I'm creating this. So I think once I got, I don't think I was ever really in a choir that was like, Sandra Snow situation, where everyone loves everything. So that's, I think, what motivated the second book was like, well, how does it work when it's really working? Because I don't think I'd ever seen that. I guess that's a complicated answer.
No, but I think that's so, to unpack it and hear that part after seeing what you've now brought to us in the choral profession, you're really adding so much because of your life experiences, your lived experiences, and then the research you've done and how you've funneled it so we can all do our research and bring the best to our singers. So I always ask one final question for any listeners there. I like them to have like one big nugget to chew on. You can be something you've already said. It can be something else. What's the one thing that really matters that you want them to walk away from this episode with?
I wish I had appreciated earlier in my career how different people have to carry different experiences, and how much more beautiful and enriching it is when there's a space for that experience in the rehearsal. It doesn't mean that there's 50 directors in the room that we each have our own opinion on intonation. It just means that there's a space for people to be authentically themselves. And I think I had spent the first part of my career trying to turn everyone into me, which didn't go very well.
How many of us can say that we tried that same thing, though? You look into your choir and you just assume they all are there because of the same reason you're there. There's so many good things to hear in this episode. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
No, thanks for the opportunity. I'm really grateful for the work you're doing. Thank you.
Don't be the protagonist. Bring all of your singers in and make sure that you are culturally aware and representative. Take time, find the definitions. Dr. Sieck has given us some of them to get started, but this is only the beginning. Figure out what your exact students need and how you can help them be their most authentic selves. And don't be scared. Just as long as you're trying and caring and aware that it's not your story, but you're creating the space for their story. A good friend once said that when you go from just being a musician into being a music educator, you become part of the business of people. How blessed are we to have people that we can make their lives better? And as we've heard in so many episodes, be the catalyst for change. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned. Thanks for listening. what you're doing. It matters. Music matters more than ever. And I'll see you tomorrow on day 4 of Teacher PD Week.